Darren, one of the things I need to do is create a consistent UI across platforms.
You should be using adaptive cards.
Yeah, adaptive cards have really come a long way, and there is a bright future that we're going to talk about in this episode of DevRadio. Hey, and welcome. This is the next episode of Dev Radio. I'm Jerry. This is Darren.
Hey.
We got Matt Heidinger. He's a program manager with the developer tools. Matt, you've been on the show before. Thanks for coming back.
I have, yeah. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk with you guys and talk with your people.
You know what? I think we're talking about adaptive cards, and I feel like adaptive cards. It was started. A hackathon, or it was a small idea that you had.
Yeah, I had a lull. I came from the Windows Phone team. We worked on live tiles. We had this thing where people wanted to make better looking live tiles than the couple of templates we kind of offer. We basically had 8 templates that you kind of hard coded, and we came up with this thing called adaptive live tiles. And then Windows Phone, rest in peace.
Yeah.
Right. And I had kind of this lull in my career in kind of like, well, what's the next thing? And started kind of saying, well, maybe this concept of this lightweight UI that could be, rendered natively. The whole point was Start was key real estate, right? For any of you folks that remember Windows Phone, I mean, that live tiles was like it, and that team that they had a lot of care and concern for those live tiles. They wanted to be beautiful. And yet at the opposite end of the spectrum, you wanted developers to be able to customize the live tiles with what they wanted. So you had this niche. Right. I can't just let them draw anything they want, because then it could make Start look bad, and that, can reflect poorly on the product. So there was this kind of need for what's something in the middle that's a little bit like a UI technology, but not quite so full featured. And we took that concept and kind of said, a couple of us started to, prototype around. Maybe that applies in other things, and you start to see like chatbots, same concept, right? If you're chatting in a product, that product, they care very much about the look and feel of that product, yet they want to make it extensible. So adaptive cards was kind of born out of this need for maybe there's this niche there in a couple cases.
It's funny because I remember when it first came to tiles, and I remember all the flexibility. And in fact, it was so much that I was like, I'm going to go back to the templates, because I'm like,
oh, I know.
I was afraid I was going to mess it up and make it look dumb,
Totally. We still have that. Any product, you get to a point where you start to introduce more complexity. You start to solve some scenarios, and you run the risk of losing kind of sight of the simplicity, or maybe even the soul, if that is kind of the product you're going for. So it is a challenge we have on how do we give people the flexibility they want, still make it approachable, still make it, and all those things. I totally get it.
Yeah. And then the crazy people made images for it too.
I was just about to say.
Exactly. Yeah.
I worked on a MapQuest for Windows Phone.
Okay.
And I built a engine that would take your turn-by-turn directions, build a bitmap, and then put it onto the tile. So on your phone, even if you had the app minimized, it would be notifying and updating on the tile.
That was the full scale, wasn't it? People used the templates. They looked beautiful. People who used the adaptive cards, they looked unique, but still were constrained to look right.
Right.
And then you had crazy people who would use images as their tile.
Those even, man, I remember meetings, this has got to be 6 years ago or whatever, but where they're like, no, we can't allow the images. We can't just block someone from doing like a custom drawn image. People would get really obsessive about the product and really want
that was a different era though, where we blocked a lot of stuff.
It was a different era.
Very prescriptive design.
That's right. All right, let's get back to adaptive cards.
All right, yeah.
Because we should have a Windows Phone call instead. Just to reminisce, what it was like. But so adaptive cards, I got to tell you, the most productive place I have ever used an adaptive card is in the bot framework. Because when I need to show something that's at all sophisticated, that makes no sense to type out or make ASCII art or something like that, I can give them instead an adaptive card, and it feels like an application. I mean, it is. I don't care what platform they're on. I don't care how they're looking at it. I know generally how it's going to appear. And that's when I really fell in love with it. So in the tile world, I saw what you were trying to do to make you know picky developers happy, but I didn't really appreciate it until I started using it in the bot framework.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, the conversations open up a whole new level to this thing. A key thing is I introduce people to adaptive cards, and just as a quick lap around, you know, it's if you're not familiar with the bot framework, it's this JSON schema. So you author your card in JSON and you say it's got UI primitives, so text blocks and images and columns and things. And you can do some lightweight customization. You can pick different sizes. You can make it bold. You know, you can do these things. But you're basically sending down this JSON payload. And the app that's rendering it takes care of making sure that it feels native. It adapts to the app that it's in.
Yeah.
And that works really great in things like bot framework. Where you're writing a bot potentially to multiple endpoints, right? You can write a bot for Teams, for even web chat hosted on your own website.
And sometimes you don't even know where it's going.
And that's I get into like where we think the future of adaptive cards, where you can really start to design these things and you really don't know where it's going. It might not even be a conversational interface. But the thing that's cool is it's not just these UI primitives, it's also input collections, so you can have actions and you can take these things, where tiles never had that. Tiles are a very read-only static thing. So conversations open up a whole door where you can author inputs in your cards, and you can really build these really compelling input collections. And then people started using it for things we never expected because of those factors, because it's JSON serialized. Everyone's got these document DBs now. They just store their card in there. A hospital, for example, they had these 400 forms that they use for all the types of data collection you could imagine happens in clinics.
Right.
And
standard and complicated and
standard
simple
and all sorts of things. And they coded them on Android and in some cases iOS. And he came to us, I think it was after Build 2017, and he was like, you know, you talked a lot about bots, you talked about skills, you talked about, you know, these other things. Would this make sense for our scenario? And we were like, well, yeah, you just want to use it for form collection. That's it. And, you know, this is before we even had a designer. So we took his advice, came up with kind of a more rich drag drop designer, and some of the stuff I can show is later is how we've just tightly integrated that. But yeah, you can just start to use them for stuff like that. If you just really want to have this form that's stored somewhere in a database, serve it down, you can do very lightweight kind of server-side UI development.
Yeah.
But yeah, it works very well in a lot of those.
And you could trust that it looks nice too. If you could almost tell your developers to use it just to ensure they have a certain design quality around it.
And that is exactly kind of what we're going for. We used to say beautiful by default. I don't know if we still say that in kind of our principles, but yeah, that was our kind of mantra within the team, is that, yeah, it's going to be beautiful is a word that, you know, leaves it's open to interpretation, right? But it's consistent by default, and that is for sure. Like it follows the same type ramps as the surrounding content. It follows the same margins and paddings, so you can have these very native apps that are written in anything: Android, iOS. Maybe they were written in React Native. Maybe they used Xamarin. Maybe they used Flutter. But you can have Windows and all of it, anything, and you can have these small little chunks of UI. That is the adaptive card. You don't have to rewrite your whole app. One of the demos I gave at Build, I was building Contoso Healthcare. It turns out, you know, I was like, well, you know, I want to build a healthcare thing, and it's this clinic, and we show how a bot can generate a card, and it gets sent to this other clinic and the same provider. And just for fun, I was like, gonna build a WinForms app and show how easy it is to also just do this WinForms app. But then I was like, you know, I can't be the first Microsoft employee to think of Contoso Healthcare. Yeah. And of course, a really quick search, and you find a GitHub repo from 2016, I want to say, where someone built a UWP WP app, a really nice, you know, healthcare app called Contoso Healthcare or something. So I took that app, just cloned it, and installed it to render adaptive cards in the, you know, the 3 minutes it takes in the build demo, just to show that you can take an existing app, just replace a chunk of it. And it was this patient intake form, basically. You know, you see these all the time, right? Or at least we're starting to see them more. You go into your dentist and they have these little mounted tablets for just check-in, a really quick like check-in type thing. Well, what if that, you know, that little screen, it's a very simple UI. it can be delivered on the service. You can design that UI in an integrated design or push it to the tablet very instantly, regardless of what the tablet UI is. And those are some kind of cool scenarios that, again, we just never thought of, but they end up working very well with this type of thing.
Yeah. Now, a card is sometimes a loaded word. If somebody says to you, "What's an adaptive card?" What do you mean? Because we don't really use that sort of thing, or they have cards in their system already, but they mean something else. Just what do you mean?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And now I'm gonna cheat a second and pull up our little catchphrase we had from Build. It took us, coming up with catchphrases, man. It's like it took us a while to distill this sentence down. But so what we like to say, it's snippets, and we start with snippets. It's snippets of, and I'm cheating. Look it over because I'm just getting back from vacation.
It's totally all right.
We talk about snippets of interactive and exchangeable content that blends natively with its surroundings. So that's it. It's snippets of UI. It's interactive, as in it has inputs, it has actions. It's exchangeable because it's JSON. Everything speaks JSON. Everything can transport JSON, so it's exchangeable, and it blends natively. So an adaptive card that was written in JSON, you've worked with Bot Framework. If you're writing a bot, you're just writing a service that's returning some JSON, and that JSON describes the content. It's I want this text to say, hello world, and I want it to be bold, and I want it to be here. Ultimately, that gets delivered somewhere to a host app, we call them. So like Teams, for example. And what they use is our rendering libraries, our rendering SDKs. You install the SDK for whatever platforms you're on. In Teams's case, they use native Android, native iOS, and then their desktop app is an Electron app, so they use our JavaScript library. And all three libraries do the same thing. They basically have a parse. You say, hey, parse this JSON, and then render this card. And then we render that card into the native UI stack that you're on. So that JSON on Android becomes native Android UI. That, on UWP, it becomes UWP XAML. If you install our WPF render, it becomes WPF XAML. And it basically just takes that JSON construct.
And if it's in a browser, it makes the HTML, all this stuff that you don't have to figure out. And by the way, you keep saying you define it in JSON, and even though I know that's right, there's also a wrapper library that makes it so that you can do the whole thing with just .this, .that, and get it right perfectly.
That's right. Yeah. So we do have both .NET and JavaScript SDAs that give you like an object model. So you could construct an object model and just say serialize this JSON. That works today. We have a new preview thing that maybe I'll get to show a little later, where we are adding data binding into the card itself, because that's a key kind of thing. Right now, the content is tightly in the card. We're getting to a world where once you can separate out the content, and you can just imagine this getting into some crazy places where now you've got these templates that can be reused. I could write a template for your stuff. One of the demos I love to give, and it's unfortunately not working as of this morning. I gave a couple sneak peeks at Build, and it was sort of working then. But it's this concept of if people are familiar with the GitHub desktop app, I use it regularly. It's just my desktop app, shows what repos I'm in, branch management things. What I wanted was I'm in the adaptive cards repo. I'd love to know the CI status of adaptivecards.io. Every time, we push, we do a CI deploy. I can go to my Azure portal and I can see all that, or I can go to DevApps and can see all that. But what I wanted to do was clone down the GitHub desktop app. It's an Electron app. So I installed our JavaScript library and thought, well, what if I wrote some Azure templates, hit the Azure endpoints? I know I'm in the GitHub repo. Can I hit the Azure endpoints? They return data for your service for adaptivecards.io, what region it's in, what's the status, what are the last deployments, what are some metrics, and it returns this JSON data. Well, what if I can write an adaptive card template for that, which is just the UI over the data, right? That makes sense. And then I just render it in the GitHub desktop app, and it in the fourth tab. So there's tabs across, and I'll try and pull up a screenshot of that. But a lot of this is covered in the build session, which I think we'll link to for people that are interested more. But it just kind of shows the distributed power of these JSON templates that are UI platform agnostic. Getting me to say, I'm a Microsoft employee, you're a Microsoft employee. We have some limited ability to, we could maybe reach out to Azure and say, hey, we've got these customers that would really like you to return adaptive cards for the endpoints.
Yeah.
I use the Azure CLI. One of the other demos I do using the Azure CLI is I get the status of my, and it's the same with like the Docker CLI. You can get the status of your container, and it pipes out a whole bunch of JSON into your terminal, whole bunch of JSON, which is great if you're going to pipe that into something useful. But if I want to display it, what if I just want to pipe that to an adaptive card template and we have a little console render? This is how adaptive cards render on anything. We wrote a little console render, it makes a little square in the terminal and it renders a little card. And it just kind of shows that you can host these JSON templates. Anything can speak them, and then take anyone else's data, Azure's data. It becomes much more realistic that we can have a template repository over Azure or any domain-specific data field, like any kind of domain where we've got this data, and then we've got these JSON templates over them, and there's no private information in that template. So with those two things, you can start to do some really neat things and just render it natively. I got a little ahead of myself in that. I wish I had some screen sharing.
Yeah, I get it. I get it.
Hopefully that was followable.
Let's talk about some of the apps or products inside Microsoft that already are friends with adaptive cards. So we know that Teams is for sure. We know the bot framework is whenever you're deploying over one of the channels, right? And that channel can take a card and make it look beautiful. We know the timeline inside Windows does it, right? Yep. That's an adaptive card. What are some others?
Yeah, so Cortana Skills are adaptive cards.
Oh, yeah, of course.
They're working on some new stuff. Cortana, interestingly, Cortana Teams, Timeline, they've all been great partners. It's been a really nice. It's been great having a variety of use cases to help us kind of hone in what is key to adaptive cards. We don't want it to swing too far towards one particular use case. Another big one is Outlook actionable messages. So if I know some of us in Microsoft seen them. Anyone who is an O365 user has the ability to deliver these actionable messages. And these are things where I see them where I own a couple of distribution lists, or anyone can make a distribution list in Microsoft. And when someone requests to join, you get a mail, and you click on, do you want to approve this? You click on a link, right? It opens a browser, and that browser, has all the stuff, and you click on approve, and it's the
That's the bummer situation, right?
That's the bummer situation. That's what we know today. That's the bummer situation.
Basically a trick link that it looks like a button, but it's not a button.
Yeah, it launches a browser. In the best case scenario, the browser does the activity and it says, okay, I'm done. You can close me now. Best case.
Right.
Most realistic, though, is it loads up the full product, whatever you're in, expense approvals, time off approval, whatever. It's the whole thing. Asks you to sign in. So actionable messages take care of all that, where you can have these lightweight card-like things right at the top of the mail. They can do asynchronous activities and actually refresh right within the mail. Yeah. And what we showed at Build, and this has worked in Outlook Desktop, and it's worked in OWA for at least the last year. And at Build, we announced iOS and Android. iOS is out now. Android should be out in the next couple of weeks. I'm always hesitant to say that because as I got back from vacation, my Twitter feed was full of a whole bunch of people like, I thought you guys said it was coming soon. And
well, and then when we send out this episode, it might be in a month's time. So it actually came out 2 weeks ago. And
Yes, that's right. But so, they're in development. Yeah. And they're cool. They're especially on a mobile experience. It's very cool if you do a lot of triage in email. It's just anywhere you might have this concept of these just kind of lightweight, interactive, actionable things. But email is a very specific domain. It's got a special set of
add a
use
couple
cases.
Extra adaptive cards just for email sort of thing.
Yeah, cards for email. You get cards for Teams. You get cards in Skills, and Skills are a particular one because a lot of them get rendered, if you will, or presented to the user in a non-visual sense. So sometimes you've got these headless devices like speakers. So adaptive cards need to adapt to that as well. So we have speech constructs in some of these things. We're working on improving that more, especially when it comes to the interactive nature. But that's the point, though. You can author this content and have it adapt to the experience. But yeah, those are the ones in timeline.
I think it's worth
Microsoft.
Actually just circling back to that, because the fact that you can annotate it so that you can there can be speech involved, and I'm sure everybody knows that's even there, and that's valuable if you're on a speaker, but it's also valuable if you are in a browser and through the bot framework as well. There's a lot of really valuable ways. I guess Skype consumer also implements cards because that's the way the bot framework renders inside Skype.
Yeah, they do. I don't know the status on if they fully released. I know it was in kind of a partial release, and then they had some priority changes, like products happen. Bots were slightly de-emphasized in the consumer space. But it's underway, and yeah, you start to see these things. We try and do the best we can to make it as easy as possible. Adaptive cards are only useful if these host apps render them, right? Like our objective is to make this an open standard. It's not a Microsoft proprietary thing. It's been open source from the beginning. All of our specs are open source. We just released last week version 1.2, and we're kicking off 1.3 planning. The community call that we do every month, we do these second Thursday of the month, we do community calls. There's public calls anyone can join. You get to interact with the team. We share anything and everything. Super early prototypes that might fail. Like we're just trying to really build this community, and reach out with anyone who sees interest in this scenario, in this kind of you've got just these lightweight interactive UIs that you want to exchange, and that includes just completely non-Microsoft like behemoths. Like we're willing to reach out with and work with anyone. We have this working group concept that right now is made up of all Microsoft employees from completely different parts of the org. And when you're in Microsoft, you realize, well, that itself is a bit of a complicated feat. Like you're signing yourself up for a fair bit of work.
Yeah, that's right.
Just in meetings alone.
Just in cross-org alignment. And so our hope long-term is to open this working group up. I'm reached out to the folks that run JSON LD because we're trying to do a little more about JSON LD just for linking documents. Becomes a really neat scenario when you start to think of, okay, you've got this JSON data, you've got these JSON card templates. It'd be neat if you could link them in some official way. But that's a public working group. You just start to realize, okay, we need to make this a little more formal. But that's our long-term hope, that this is really an industry-wide standard for just exchanging lightweight content.
Are you doing anything with the Power Platform and Power Apps? Because that seems like a great fit for this sort of lightweight UI.
Yeah, it is a great fit. Flow is one of the, so Power Platform is a handful of things. And I'm personally just really starting to get into it more so, but it very much is a perfect fit. I didn't quite realize the community that they had until my Twitter following really started going up once Flow and just a lot of these Flow and citizen developer type people that are out there and just want to write like a little bit of code or as much code as necessary to get their job done. Which That's makes total sense. I mean, I remember reading one of my first software books when I got into software development, and it's like, what are we paid to do? And it's not write code. It's not at all. It's either solve some business problem. We're solving problems, and Flow and Power Apps is a kind of compelling way to solve some of these problems without jumping right to code. So, Flow has an action today where you can orchestrate these things, and one of the things that you can send as part of the flow is an adaptive card, and you can send it to teams. Right now, hopefully by the time this call comes out, you'll be able to collect data. Right now, it's a one-way card, so you can basically, your flow can send a card to, say, a channel and teams or a user and say, hey, I completed this thing. Right now, we're working on so you can have inputs in the card and actually collect data, and then act on that card. That will kick off another flow, and then that flow can act on the data and continue on, and you get this completely no code way of orchestrating some of these things.
Yeah, it's nice. Now wait, so the website is adaptivecards.io. There's a lot going on there. You want to walk us through the site?
Yeah, so adaptivecards.io is where you would really go to get started. So our homepage is kind of say, we had this little opening video that talks about everything we just covered. So it's purely native, et cetera, et cetera. Where I like to go first is the samples. And these are really kind of what they say here. So these samples are really about inspirational stuff. So here's a good one. Like, this is maybe a task or something. It's like, I need to publish the schema back in this, it's created here. Here's these things. And I can set a due date for it. You can see I've got these input selections. I can maybe comment. So
that is such a rich interface just right there. Like, just imagine.
Just casually thrown together with a little bit of JSON and boom, there it is.
A little bit of JSON. And this is the key thing. So there's this interactivity here. These cards showing other cards. That's a type of action we have. So we have this actions array. Mm-hmm. And the type of action is action.showCard. And then the title here is set due date. That's what you're seeing. And then here's the card that it's going to show when you expand that card. And in this case, it's just an input.date or an input.comment. So you can build this level of interactivity without jumping to code. So adaptive cards are never about writing code. They're always purely declarative, but you can construct these things to get a level of interactivity.
Yeah.
And so we have a handful of other ones. Flight itinerary. This one I actually borrowed from Facebook Messenger. This is one of their templates where it's a flight itinerary template, or they had a flight update template. And the whole scenario here that we wanted to see if maybe we can improve upon is, in the Facebook parlance in Messenger, this is a data schema. This is, you say, I'm picking the template flight update. Passengers is an array of strings. The seats is an array. The flight number, and it's purely data. And they take on the burden of laying it out almost exactly like this. If I had time and I searched up Facebook's flight update template, it would look almost exactly like this, but purely data, which means every airline has the same template. Every airline, they basically give you this logo here to change. So this would be Delta's logo or Alaska's logo or something. But every airline basically gets that same template, and Facebook owns the presentation of that data. So what we did was try to say, okay, can we rebuild this concept using adaptive card building blocks? And I could click on, say, try it yourself here. What that loads is our second link up here, which is our designer. And this is newish. We've had this out for a little bit, but it basically says, here's the JSON down here. If you don't care about that JSON, that's great. You can click hide, and we've got a kind of visual tree to start playing with some of the elements. So I could click on this text, and here I'm in a text block, and here's all the properties I can set. So large, small, medium. Again, you're not picking font sizes. That's not the point. You're describing your content in sort of a semantic way. The color here, you can see it's visually red. Well, how did I do that? Well, color is attention, or I can say good, or I can say warning. And that's basically going to translate into some visual appearance or potentially audibly at render time. So what you can,
it's a very declarative way, but it also supports things like accessibility, so that, as you kind of alluding to there, a reader of that could understand, okay, this is something that I need to draw attention to, and so on.
That's exactly right. And, especially in things like high contrast scenarios, we make sure the color contrast is going to be right. So this other drop down here where I can preview what this card would look like in various apps. I can actually click on Cortana skills, where instead of a light background on dark text, I'm going to get a dark background on light text.
Sure.
The card's completely changed its appearance, yet me authoring this JSON, if I'm writing a bot, I've written it once, now I can get this bot in Cortana. Cortana's happy because this looks exactly like their surrounding experience. Windows Timeline, as an example, it's now changed again. Well, this is a fixed height card, so it's clipping a little bit off the bottom, but it basically will take on the appearance of, I could show, Teams dark, I could show Teams light, and you just start to see some of the adaptive nature of this thing. And this tool is showing, it's a web tool, obviously, so it's rendering these things in HTML elements, but this same card, on Teams, obviously this is going to render as just native UI on that platform. So this designer tool basically simulates these experiences.
So in that dropdown where you select whatever the rendering host is going to be, What I don't see there is WinForms. So in your build session, you were showing this in WinForms. How'd you accomplish that?
So there's an interesting descriptor I always like to add. So adaptive cards are on a platform, but then they're hosted inside of an app.
Yeah.
So you don't, like, when you're writing a card for Microsoft Teams, let's say Teams had a WinForms app. You don't even know that. You don't even care about that. You're writing some JSON and you're sending it to Teams. A question that I'll sort of tease into this is, people ask, how do I get started with adaptive cards? How do I get started? And it's a bit of a problem for us because there really isn't one way to get started. If I click on our documentation here, which is really the kind of final link there, we have this getting started section, and we really have 3 different sections. So if you want to write a bot, your getting started is bot framework for the most part. We talk about, how you write a bot, how you send this card. But if you're an Outlook developer, that card is attached to an email. It has a completely different flow and cycle. It's the same card JSON itself, but the way it was transported is completely different. And the same thing if you're a Windows developer, writing for timeline. We have these WinRT APIs where you say, here's my user activity, and here's my adaptive card content. In all of these cases, the transport is completely differently. The card got there some different way, and we are completely agnostic to how that goes. As a real quick, just to kind of dive in to change it completely, I've got this Contoso healthcare portal, which I didn't fully style up, unfortunately. But this is really showing a handful of things that I've got these card templates, and I'm deciding how I'm rendering them in my app. So I'm using the rendering SDKs as I want. Whereas in the bot world, you're writing a card for another app. That's really you're either writing a card designed to be sent to another app. Maybe you're writing a skill, maybe you're writing a bot, maybe you have an app and you want to get the history back in timeline. So all you're doing is writing JSON, and we call those people card authors, and we have a particular set of tools for card authors.
Right.
The flip side of it,
you have 2 SDKs basically
for card authoring, but it's really just we have ways of helping you generate JSON. The other part of it, though, is you've got the JSON, and now you want to render it. And I was going to see if I can pull over a quick code snippet that shows how that works, because it's pretty straightforward. The code for this app, and this is by the time this releases, I'd like to kind of call attention to this, and maybe I'll be able to send you guys a link. But the hope with this project is that this source code I'm going to release, and it's going to be like a kitchen sink of everything adaptive cards. I'm going to clean up the presentation a little bit, but I didn't use a front-end framework, so it's all plain JavaScript, just showing how you can use adaptive cards in some kind of advanced scenarios. So to show you what I mean by advanced scenarios, let's look at these appointments here. So I built an admin interface where I can click on the back end. And what I've got here, or what I show really in the build demo, and if I had my Android tablet, I would show you. We talked a little bit about the whole, I've got this hospital and I've got these forms. So let's say I've got this referral intake form. So these are little card previews of the different forms that the hospital presents. So I've got my patient intake form, and what's happening here is I click on this, is it's loading the designer, the adaptive card designer, inside this app in a little modal pop-up. So it used to be that if you wanted to design a card, we would say, go to adaptivecards.io, click on the designer, design your card, and then, copy the JSON and then do something with it. But what we wanted to do was offer, and I'll pull up that link real quick. We have an actual JavaScript package that is the designer itself. So if you want to embed the designer in your app, you can absolutely do that. And what this is showing, so I can say, hi, Jerry, or whatever I'm editing here. If I click on save, it's saving the card. You see it's updated there. I click on it, load. It's basically saving that JSON in my backend. And now if I had my Android tablet, which is connected to that same backend, and I'm, a new patient walks in, I want to give them the patient intake form. I hand them the Android tablet. The Android tablet pulls down this JSON and renders it. all right there natively on Android. So right now, if I loaded up that app, it would show the Hi Jerry. And if I wanted to change this, it gives just a really user-friendly, an admin now can, rearrange these things. I can move the date of birth, to the bottom, or I can add a completely new field in here. I can add completely new sections. And it empowers, you talk about kind of the Power Platform, it empowers these power users in a way, or they don't even have to be power users. This is a relatively simple interface. You click on admin, it basically, it's almost like a CMS type thing, but for cards, right? It's like you used to, if you wanted to come up with a blog, you were writing HTML. That was your only hope, in the 90s, right? You're writing HTML. And then these CMS platforms came out. You had these web editors that let you do text. You can almost think of it as the same thing. I've got this card, I've got this integrated designer. This designer has a toolbar up here. And so the API we provide lets you change that toolbar. You can change, and it's not styled very pretty, unfortunately, in here, but I've added this save button.
Oh, so you can put in custom actions that make
sense. You can put in custom actions, and it's pretty simple. So if I show you the form editor there, to show the designer, let me make this a little bigger. It's a very simple API effectively. I can collapse APIs, or I can collapse certain panes, but somewhere when I
So this is where your developer will be involved in kind of enabling this scenario, and then after that, your power users are effectively in here able to update the forms without needing IT to move JSON around, develop code.
That's the exact hope. Yeah. So I'm basically newing up a designer. I pass in those host containers, and that's that drop down you saw on adaptivecards.io. So, this in this particular case, it wouldn't make any sense to, and this designer, we have all these drop down. These are our host containers, we call them. Well, if I'm in my healthcare clinic, I don't need to see Outlook actual messages here, right? I want to hide this completely. And you can see we've got these other buttons up here. We have a button that links to our documentation. We have a handful of buttons that we're using the same APIs as we host it. The Contoso clinic just needs a close button and a save button. And the save button is pretty simple here. We basically new up a toolbar button, give it some text, and then it has this function that's going to be invoked when you click on the button, which in this case,
that function that I have to fill out with the
exactly. And all I'm doing is saying I'm saying designer.getCard. I'm basically getting the JSON out, and I'm calling my API to save it, and then I'm refreshing, and then I'm hiding the designer. So, I wrote a little bit of code, and it's this integrated designer, and now you've just got this completely service delivered thing into any app, into any platform, all in this kind of integrated admin interface. So this will be released here pretty soon.
Hey, now, Matt, go back to the designer for just a second. Not here in the app, but your full-on designer that you have. And talk to me about how data binding is going to show up.
Yeah, that's a great question. So another thing that like what we don't have right now is this text says delayed. If you want to fill this with real data, like what is the real status here, you would do what you said. You'd install our C# library on NuGet. You'd use our JavaScript one, and you would say new text block.text equals, and then you'd fill it in. And it's kind of a bummer experience because once you've done that, once you've taken it out of its JSON form and turned it into C# code, you now have no way of pasting it back into the designer. Your JSON stuff is gone. What I'd like to do here is just say, this is, status, some kind of curly brace, right? Bind to some status. Yeah. So what we have available to people today is a vnext.adaptivecards.io/designer. It's basically the site. And so this is a vNext version. It looks very similar. I'll make it a little bigger.
Card payload on the left, data on the right. That's nice.
Heavily inspired. If you have any, we got a little nostalgic on Windows Phone. I'm gonna get a little nostalgic here again on Blend. Oh man, I miss Blend. Yeah, right. We took the sample data concept. So let me just click on a kind of new card here, and I'm gonna add in a text block, and I'll just say, hi. Curly brace name, and then over in sample data, I'm just going to say name Matt. And you can see it's still okay. It's just showing what the card would look like. But you can click on preview mode, And that's going to basically apply the sample data with the design time experience. So now you've got this JSON, and I can come up with, let me see if I've got, I know we're running short on time, see if I can pull up some cool examples. So let's take this stock update one, for example. And I'll probably go back to, just for fun, I'll go into this guy just to show it, because I think this particular designer has a little bit more features. But let's say I want to write a stock card, right? This is what it would look like. The company name, the stock symbol, blah, blah. It's not super appealing when you see it like that. But what I'm going to do is paste in some stock data that you would have gotten from a site. Paste that in, click on preview mode. One of the things failed. But you start to see, okay, this is pretty cool. Now I can visualize and design my card.
No, Matt, it's not more. It's way more than pretty cool. You know what would be awesome is if every single REST interface had a /card and it gave you back the default template. That would be awesome.
Well, let me show you this really quick, because this, I think, is the slightly more realistic version of that, and something we want to at least empower until that becomes a reality that I personally am interested in. Because these templates, so another thing on the Contoso Clinic page on the home page here are all these cards, and you can see I've got just weather and stock data. So that is powered by this app.json, and it's these home cards. So I'll just delete a couple, just get rid of these out of here, and you'll see this will refresh. And I'll explain really quick what's going on in here. So that's going to refresh. There's going to be, what is there going to be? There's going to be a Microsoft quote and a Google quote. I deleted the weather card on accident. But what's going on here is I'm saying, hey, for all those home cards, here's the data URL, and I'll click on that, and I'll click on this template URL as well. These are just publicly addressable URLs. And they're loading up right now. Here, this is a public stock API that someone offers, that IX trading offers. So this is this live stock quote, right? Just data, just pure data.
Yeah.
This is a adaptive card template, the same one that I just pasted into the designer. You can see there's nothing private. There's no private or personally identifiable information in here. There's some expressions. I'm saying if the change, as in the stock change, is greater than 0, I'm going to show this up arrow. And for the color, I'm going to say if the change is greater than 0, I'm going to do good. So it's the template. I can do some things like formatting. And so with these two pieces of data, my app is able to pull that data down and then render a template. So as just like an example, we'll add in, just for fun, we'll just do let's get AAPL. We'll use the same template. If I didn't delete the weather one, you'd see the same concept. The concept is exactly the same. You've got this data somewhere, and now I've got a template somewhere. Well, imagine this was a slightly more user-friendly URL. And because I don't want to break the build that's going on, I'll just bring it over. Imagine instead of the data going here, what if adaptive cards could help offer a repository of sorts? And so imagine, there was HTTPS templates.adaptivecards.io, /IEX, some namespace, and then it would be, a stock. And then what if we offered something for, Azure templates? So there's Azure templates, and I want to know about my web app. I want to know about my deployments. I want to know, and it's basically these templates and these repositories, because there's nothing private to them. We can crowdsource them. Anyone can help build these templates. Anyone can open a PR. If this is just a GitHub repository, anyone can open a PR and say, hey, I wrote a template over this type of data. Here it is. Host it somewhere. And now the data binding, this is the key thing. The template binding is happening client side. It's not happening on some server. My app, so I wrote this whole home cards thing, right? This is some data thing I came up with, data URL and template URL. But the code for it is as simple as you would expect. So if I click on this load custom cards, it's this 6 lines of code. I'm using jQuery again because I want to keep it pretty simple. I'm looping over that JSON array, home cards. I'm using jQuery, $.getJSON, get the data from this template, get the template. When the template comes back, I'm going to get the data, And then I'm going to say utils.renderCard, and that's basically using our new data binding SDKs. These are the things we don't have available yet. We're going to release very soon, probably by the time this call is out, a preview version of our adaptive card library that adds the data binding support. So instead of
this code, but also the technique that you're going through, this is all in the build. We'll make sure that the build session is linked here as well.
Right.
Man, there's a lot going on, and if developer is really interested in getting involved in adaptive cards, I think it's important to know that you have this once a month community call that they could really start getting involved. If they want to change the direction a little bit to make sure that their industry or special use case is accounted for, then that's the right place to be heard. And
that is the right place to be heard. And I share my private email, my work email. It's just matt.heidinger@microsoft.com. And you can find us on my email on Twitter @MattHeidinger. You know, we definitely want to make sure we're accounting for these different use cases. And we're just very not prescriptive in things. So I happen to build this for Contoso Healthcare, but I just use the building blocks.
Yeah, that's right. Cool, Matt. There's a lot going on with adaptive cards. I feel like you could keep talking if we really pushed you here. But at the same time, all good things here. And so let's make sure that all the developers understand where they can go to get more information about the cards. Of course, they know how to get in touch with you as well. And honestly, if they're using anything around the bot framework or interacting with teams or something along those lines, if they haven't discovered cards yet, then they don't know the luxury that's at their fingertips.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, so find us at adaptivecards.io. Reach out to me. This source code will be available soon. Check out the build talk. I'll update that if you really want to dive in. And we hope people reach out if this is interesting.
Good job, Matt. Thanks for being on the call today.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, cool. Thanks, guys.